Hello and welcome to the CSN3M Mindset Monday podcast. I'm Andrew Wade with Case Specific Nutrition. On this channel, we focus on the 3M's: mindsets, myth busting, and mentoring, all as they pertain to health and nutrition. On today's episode, we are going to be discussing the role and the function of insulin. And this is a really important podcast in the world of research, particularly as it pertains to obesity and certain metabolic syndromes, and as well as inflammatory conditions with systemic inflammation. Insulin is an extremely important hormone in our body. And it's actually, I like to call it a taxi cab. It's a transporter at base. But it has a lot of roles in our body. I'm not going to dig too heavily in detail, but instead I want to spend a little bit of time breaking down what it does and why that's important to you. And also, I'm hoping that it will show you some of the reasons and rationale for certain recommendations, as well as also give you a sneak peek into why there's so much variability in diet recommendations. Why is it that some people can eat 6 meals a day and seem to be really lean and body burning and weight neutral, while others, if they eat that frequently, seem to gain weight constantly and instead might eat twice a day or 3 times a day and notice more stability in their body, where some people would eat 2 or 3 times a day and would notice the exact opposite. And so, once again, we all are unique in a lot of ways. And while we have the same systems and a lot of the same hormones, the way they're all balanced into our own unique individual cocktail does lead to some variance in terms of how our body responds. So, at base, insulin is a taxi cab, and its main role is to shuttle carbohydrates around the body. And so, when we eat food, and that food hits our mouth, if there is carbohydrate and sugar present in that food, it starts to get broken down in our tongue by a digestive enzyme called amylase. And when amylase hits and spikes in our tongue and in our mouth, it actually spikes through one of the glands in our cheek. But regardless, when that gets secreted, that's the first signal. It says, hey, carbohydrates are coming. And the pancreas starts to get ready. And then the food goes into the stomach and then into the small intestine. And when it hits the small intestine, the pancreas releases insulin, amongst other things, some other enzymes. And insulin then picks up carbohydrate once it's broken down into sugar. So if it's a pixie stick or some candy, it's a sugar already. And so it's immediately doesn't need to break down or digest. So it's already broken down when it hits the mouth, already broken down when it's in the stomach, gets into the intestine, gets picked up right away. And insulin then basically is what transports it through the bloodstream and sends it, once the sugar enters the bloodstream, the insulin connects with it. And when it connects with it, it takes it where the body needs it to go. And so I mentioned, obviously, candy goes straight through and gets to the bloodstream within minutes, where something like oatmeal might take 3 hours to slowly but surely work its way. So, you get 30% per hour, over the course of a few hours, and the body gets a little bit of carbohydrate. And so the larger the amount of sugar in the bloodstream, the larger the insulin spike, which is why eating a piece of candy that's pure sugar that's all in the bloodstream within minutes spikes your insulin and leads to the body basically putting more insulin in the blood and then navigating and kind of taking that around. But it's also why a lot of people will get low blood sugar an hour or 2 or even 3 hours after they eat something that's very simple. And it's because their body pushes too much insulin out, and then that insulin ends up taking a bunch of the blood sugar that's meant to be there, that's supposed to keep us stable and cognitively functioning and not in a coma. Where when you eat something like an oatmeal, your body only secretes a little bit of an insulin at a time. And so we don't get this big spike and big crash. Instead, we just get sort of a time-release delivery. That'll also change how our body directs and where it sends it. And so if our bloodstream has a ton of sugar in it all at once, the body wants to get it different places. And so it's more likely to say, send this to the muscles and send this to the brain. send that to the liver, and then, oh, there's still some left over. Let's send that to, our remaining glycogen stores in our muscles or in our liver, but those are full. Okay, we can go ahead and store those in fat deposits. Where if we eat something that's a little bit more carb moderated or a little bit, portioned a little bit better, our body's going to basically distribute that fuel in a time released format. Again, it will end up going to places that it's going to burn instead of store. So, like I said, at its base, insulin is a taxi cab, and its job is to shuttle sugar around the blood and send it to the different organs in our body. And again, the more sugar that's in our bloodstream all at once, the larger the insulin spike, which means the more places it gets sent. But what's interesting is when insulin is in the bloodstream, it also is a signal. Our body is a really unique cascade where just like the amylase secretion in our mouth leads to hydrochloric acid secretion in our stomach, which leads to sodium bicarbonate secretion in our intestine, and all of those things prime our pancreas to secrete enzymes and insulin. Our body works in a cascade. Insulin takes its role in the cascade, and insulin is the thing that, when present, tells us that food is present and that we don't need to tap into our fat reserves or our carb stores, that our body has food coming so we don't need to burn what we currently have reserved or saved for a rainy day, right? For when we're starving or not able to eat. And so insulin kind of waves a flag and says, hey, food is coming, don't burn fat. And that's a very efficient thing because it allows our body to sort of burn the fuel that's in front of it. And it, is the reason that then the muscles take it up and, the varying organs utilize that carbohydrate. And that is part of the reason why during a runner can take in some carbohydrate and it's in their muscles within minutes. And it's because insulin is doing its job very well. So insulin has a very, very important role in our body. Now, what can happen, though, is in certain people, particularly if there's a genetic tendency, and then also over years of environmental abuse, which would be poor diet habits or poor eating habits, you can eat meals that are very high in carbohydrate and very high in non-fibrous, very fast digesting carbohydrate. A lot of the processed foods that exist, if we eat them in excess, it's very easy to sit down and eat a lot more of carbohydrates at once than the body needs. And so then insulin starts to spike, and that spike can lead to a crash, and that leads to us wanting more carbohydrate. And you probably know somebody who you notice seems to always be snacking constantly. And that grazing tendency of always feeling hungry, always needing carbohydrate, is a mark of having what's called high fasted insulin, which is to say that insulin, when it spikes, it gets into the blood, it's there for about 3 hours, and then it basically breaks down and it's gone. But if you're eating fast digesting, fast to the bloodstream foods, your insulin levels spike high and they don't get to come back down before you need to eat again. So you eat again and again and again, and the insulin, instead of going from a 0 up to a 100, then back to a 0, it goes 0, 100, 20, 120, 40, 140, and so on and so forth. And that's what leads to us having insulin levels in our bloodstream all the time. And now, right now, I want to stop and make sure I note this because this is a really important sort of discrepancy in understanding. So earlier when I explained that oatmeal, time release, slow digest, doesn't spike a bunch of insulin, because it doesn't cause a huge spike up, the body then gets back to 0 a little bit more easily. Versus someone that eats a lot of refined sugary candy and chocolate and cake and stuff all at once, it's going to spike higher, and as a result takes longer to go back down, even if the blood sugar crashes more quickly. But when we have people that do different dietary recommendations, right? Like, oh, well, I eat 6 times a day versus I eat 2 times a day. One of the things that's worth noting is that people that eat 6 times a day probably have very good insulin sensitivity, which means their insulin responds really well. But if they're eating that way and it's working well for them, that likely means one of 2 things, and sometimes even both of these things, which is that the foods they're eating are not secreting a ton of insulin. So they're eating slow digesting foods. They're having some oatmeal, and then they're having a piece of fruit, and then they're having a lunch that has, brown rice or sweet potato in it with vegetables. They're eating meals that don't spike a ton of insulin. And so they eat a meal and there's a small spike, and then it goes back to base, and then they eat a meal, and it's just a nice rhythm back and forth that puts their body and gives it continuous fuel. Most of the time, people that eat that often, it's because they're very physically active, and that's where their body benefits. It gives them consistent fuel, but we have to remember that exercise actually kind of pairs up with insulin and secretes something called GLUT4, which is a hormone out of the muscles that works like insulin. If insulin's a taxi cab, it's kind of like Uber, where it brings things directly to the muscle. And so the body gets into a place where it's burning more because of the exercise, and also gets into the place where it's directing the fuel towards burning as opposed to directing it towards storing. And again, the difference, though, can really be the quality of the food. Someone that snacks all day on random, handfuls of this and that versus someone who actually eats meals, there's a reason why there's usually a very big difference in outcome. One, snacks don't actually satisfy our appetite. They don't fulfill us. They just snooze it. We get less hungry for a moment, and then all of a sudden we're even hungrier than we were. Then we get less hungry. All of a sudden we're hungrier than we were, and it builds and builds. Where a meal is meant to, we have hunger, we eat the meal, we feel satisfied, and a meal has all the components in digestion that slow the process down so that we feel satisfied longer, which means less insulin spikes and there's a bigger break between feedings. So we can already see where the idea of eating 6 times a day, there's a difference between eating 6 meals a day like a bodybuilder would, where they're eating rice and broccoli and chicken multiple times a day, versus the common American tendency to grab granola bars and Cheez-Its and chips and pretzels and cookies as snack food all throughout the day, where those things aren't being slowed down by protein and fiber from vegetables. They're not being slowed down in the stomach by fats being digested. They are being quickly digested. They're in the bloodstream. They spike the insulin, and they don't satisfy us. So then we eat again and again and again. And where this can get dangerous, and this happens in a lot of people, is over time you can get high fasted insulin, which means your fasted insulin levels, when you're not eating, your insulin levels are elevated. Well, remember, insulin waves a flag that says food is coming, don't burn fat. It tells the body that we're in a fed state. And as a result, it can get to a point where your body becomes very unwilling to utilize its own reserves of energy because insulin is inhibiting it even when you're not eating. And that can be tricky because if your body's not able to use its carb stores and its fat stores, it's going to make you hungry. And so all of a sudden you get hungrier and hungrier, and you eat more and more often, and it continues to spike insulin and continues to worsen the problem. And so this doesn't happen in everybody by any means, but there are a lot of people that struggle with high fasted insulin, and the eating pattern that shows us insulin is interfering with our hunger and fullness cues and our body's ability to utilize energy normally. And so that is where you hear a lot of talk about the intermittent fasting, and also where people discuss the ketogenic diet as 2 interventions that are being tested. For those who have high fasted insulin, obviously going on a ketogenic diet where you remove carbohydrates, which removes the use or need for insulin, means insulin levels go down. And then for those that utilize intermittent fasting, eating less often, eating filling meals that regulate your appetite and slow digestion down less often are going to lead to a smaller insulin spike, and also going to give more time between your insulin spikes, which allows your insulin to go downward. Now, today I'm not going to dig into a ton of detail on keto and intermittent fasting. They are both extremely complex topics that have a lot of considerations and a lot of research and a lot of work that still needs to be done in them. So they will be reserved for their own episodes. But for now, just note that the reason why those diets do exist is for people at base with high fasted insulin. And I will say that a lot of people that don't have high fasted insulin are utilizing them, and that is not necessarily, it's not necessary, which is something that we'll dig into another day. But it's just worth noting that there are small groups and small populations that actually has some really valid considerations for. But getting back to insulin, we can see where eating slow digesting carbohydrates, balanced meals, real food meals that have protein, that have fats, that have vegetables, that have produce in them, that have carbohydrates in them, are going to be one of the best things that we can do. And when we want to eat snacks, I did a really a podcast that I personally enjoyed and I got a lot of great feedback on called Lonely Foods a couple months ago. And I talked about how we don't want to make snacks, there's certain snacks that we know they're lonely foods, and we know that because when we eat them, we want to eat more and more and more of them. And I talked about things like Oreos and, other sugary foods that when we eat them by themselves, we don't feel satisfied, so we eat more. This is a case and a support or the, sort of the metabolic rationale for why lonely foods should have friends, is because when we eat a snack of, an apple with some peanut butter, that digests slowly and gradually, and that slow and gradual digestion affects insulin, which affects the signaling of our hunger and fullness cues, our body's utilization of energy, and as a result, our metabolism and our body's willingness to tap into reserves if needed. So insulin is a really, really important thing to understand for most people, and it's not something that it still needs to be researched in a lot of ways, to be perfectly honest. And so just something to really dig into and kind of, maybe we'll probably have to do an additional podcast on this, but I want to at least scratch the surface on it today and, help people understand why there are some that might benefit from eating more often versus less often, but note that the difference between the two is likely the quality of food that exists in those meals and the balance of those foods. How appetite regulating are they? How slow digesting are they? Can we eat meals that taste good, fill us, and also digest slowly, which allow us to have lower insulin spike, which means that hormone gets used properly instead of excessively used. And that's what over time can prevent us from getting elevated levels of CRP, which is a measure of inflammation, and other full-bodied inflammatory issues. There's certain other compounds in the body like tumor necrosis factor and other things, interleukin 6, that once again, I don't want to dig into excess detail, but all of those can end up kind of whisper down the lane. Adiponectin's another one that's worth noting. They all kind of whisper down the lane, and in the face of high fasted insulin and in the face of sort of that metabolic dysfunction, can all start to overreact, and that can lead to the body getting into a really inflamed place, and that can lead to poor health. And so it's really important to note that insulin is a really good thing and a very positive thing, but just like our body gets used to caffeine if it's in our bloodstream too much, or our body gets used to antibiotics, and just like bacteria get antibiotic resistant, our body will get insulin resistant if there's too much insulin being constantly pumped into it, which is a case for why we want to make sure when we eat a meal that fills us and fuels us. Ideally, it has multiple ingredients and has the protein and the vegetable that helps slow the digestion down, and the fats that help satisfy and signal and tell the body that it's satisfied and full, and the carbohydrates that help energize, and ideally a good combination of complex, slow digesting carbohydrates that trickle into the bloodstream so that the body can utilize the energy, and that our insulin levels can go back to base. For those of you that this podcast is making suspicious of having high fasted insulin, this is not a case for never eating carbohydrates again. This isn't meant to scare you. Instead, it's meant to give you some understanding that you can then build upon. I would encourage you to reach out to a dietitian. You can reach out to us here at Case Specific Nutrition if you'd like, because if you do have high fasted insulin, there are dietary protocols that are not permanent, but instead are kind of short term, that we can utilize to try and get your body back into a reset state where it's burning appropriately, which helps you find your regulation of appetite, which helps you find your energy stability, which helps you find your metabolism, and can get back to really feeling like your body is on your side, and actually listening to you. So for those of you out there that are constantly hungry or feeling like you're always in the need for snacking, or you say that you always have carb cravings, that's definitely a reason to reach out to a dietitian that can help you understand what your body's actually asking and why it might be asking that, and then looking into some pretty simple ways such as making sure we have snacks that are paired with things so they digest more slowly, or taking the time to actually eat real meals that truly fill us instead of skipping meals because we don't have time. Little things like that, little intentional interventions can have a huge impact on how your body receives signaling and how it receives the energy that we are trying to give it. So there you have it. That is an Insulin 101. It is a part of a large, complicated cascade that's very, very important to us. And if we eat well and we eat correctly, we can actually really support it well. And if we have a diet that is imbalanced and doesn't contain the things that our body really needs, we can see the dysfunction and imbalance that happens over time, and it can become very frustrating initially, and it can also become somewhat threatening if it continues, which is part of the reason why case specific nutrition continues to work on growing and expanding, so that we can help people understand why they want to eat well, and then also help them improve and repair their relationship with food, so they have good connection with hunger and good connection with fullness and good connection with food and meals and eating, and all the things that supports in our day-to-day lives and our health journey. Thank you again, as always, for listening to CSN3M Mindset Mondays. Please subscribe to our channel and share with a friend or loved one. We use the hashtag #SpreadTheHealth as a part of our campaign to help people understand their body and their journey. For more case-specific nutrition content, please follow us on social media at case-specific nutrition, and you can also check out our website at case-specificnutrition.com. We will be back next week with another CSN3M Mindset Monday.